Steve Rogers is the most straightforward character in the MCU. He's good. He does the right thing.
But we did it so that people could be free.
He punches Nazis. He shows up. What's complicated about that? Every other Avenger has a journey. Tony Stark has to learn that he isn't the most important person in the room. Thor has to learn what it actually means to be worthy, multiple times. Even characters like Wanda or Natasha are defined by loss, by failure, by the version of themselves they're trying to become. They all start broken and spend their arcs trying to fix something. Steve Rogers starts the movie as the finished product. He doesn't learn courage. He already has it. He doesn't discover humility. He was born with it.
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
He doesn't grow into his values. He walks in with them fully formed. I mean, he already says his iconic line from the beginning.
I can do this all day.
By every conventional definition of storytelling, Steve Rogers has a flat character arc, and for a long time, that was the criticism. He's too good, too simple, too boring. But here's what that criticism misses. Steve doesn't have a flat arc because the writers ran out of ideas. He has a flat arc because he isn't built for change. And in a world that never stops changing, a world that left him behind the moment he went into the ice, that isn't a strength. That's the loneliness at the center of everything he does. So why does the most morally simple Avenger have the most tragic story in the entire franchise? But to understand why Steve Rogers is the way he is, why he can't change, why he won't, we have to go back to where he started. Not 2011, not the MCU. We have to go back to 1941. This video is meant to answer one question. What does it cost to be Steve Rogers? Not Captain America, Steve Rogers? Because defining the mantle doesn't start without defining the man. It was a time of deep passion. Hitler was grabbing all of Europe. We had Nazis in America. Nazis holding mass meetings in Madison Square Garden. Captain America was created in that atmosphere. He was a natural outgrowth of the passionate mood of the country. That's Jack Kirby, one half of the duo that created Steve Rogers in 1941. Him and Joe Simon, two Jewish men from New York, did something that, at the time, was genuinely dangerous. They put a man in a red, white, and blue suit on the cover of a comic book, punching Adolf Hitler in the face, a full year before America even entered the war. This wasn't just a comic book decision. It was a statement, and the death threats they received proved that people understood exactly what they were saying. But here's what makes that origin so important. Kirby and Simon didn't create a superhero who would grow into his ideals. They created a man who already had them. Steve Rogers, before the serum, was a scrawny, sickly kid from Brooklyn who kept walking into fights he had no business being in. He wasn't brave because he was strong. He was brave because he genuinely could not look the other way. He tried to enlist 5 times. 5 times he was rejected. And every single time, he walked back in and tried again. The serum didn't make Steve Rogers who he was. It just made him harder to kill. The super soldier serum enhanced everything: his strength, speed, agility, endurance, reflexes. He became a peak human specimen by every physical measure. But the thing that actually made him dangerous wasn't the serum. It was the mind and the will that were already there. He is a master tactician, a gifted field commander, and a hand-to-hand combatant whose style blends boxing, judo, and his own acrobatic instincts into something uniquely his. The shield isn't just a weapon, it's an extension of how he thinks. Defensive first, precise, never wasteful. And then there's Red Skull, Johann Schmidt. If Steve Rogers is the idea of America at its best, selfless, principled, willing to die for something bigger than himself, then Red Skull is the idea of power stripped of everything human. He was Hitler's chosen. A man who looked at the worst impulses of the 20th century and decided they weren't going far enough. He is not just Steve's greatest enemy. He is his ideological opposite. Every time they fight, it isn't just a physical battle. It's an argument about what human beings are capable of. Steve says the best of us. Red Skull says the worst. That tension never gets old because it never gets resolved. Steve's villain roster includes Baron Zemo, whose hatred of Captain America is generational and personal, Crossbones, the brutal enforcer who represents violence without cause or conscience, and Modok, Arnim Zola, and a rotating cast of Hydra operatives who represent institutions built on corruption. What's interesting is that Steve's villains are rarely random. They're almost always ideological. Someone trying to prove that his belief system is naive, that good men finish last, that the world he's fighting for doesn't exist. And for a while, it seemed like they might be right. By the mid-1940s, Captain America's popularity was already fading. The war that made him necessary was over. And without Nazis to punch, nobody quite knew what to do with him. Marvel, then called Timely Comics, tried everything. They had him fighting gangsters. They folded him into teen books. Nothing worked. Captain America Comics ended in 1950 with dwindling sales and no clear identity. The character who was created to represent an unshakable ideal had become a product nobody wanted. And here is where it gets interesting for our thesis. They kept trying to change him to fit the times, and every single time it failed, because Steve Rogers isn't built for reinvention. He's built for a specific kind of world, and when that world disappeared, he disappeared with it. Then, in 1964, Stan Lee brought him back. The Avengers #4 pulled Steve out of the ice, and immediately the first thing Lee did was make him grieve. Everyone he knew was gone. Bucky was dead. The world had moved on without him. And Steve Rogers, this man of unshakable certainty, was suddenly completely alone in a present he didn't recognize. This is where the man out of time was truly born. Not as a fun fish-out-of-water gimmick, but as genuine tragedy. A man whose values were forged in 1941, trying to find his footing in a world that had no use for that kind of certainty anymore. Comics leaned into this hard. Stories began depicting a brooding, melancholic Steve Rogers carrying survivors' guilt over Bucky's death, wrestling with whether his World War II morality had any place in the modern era. Writers used him as a mirror for whatever America was going through. During Watergate and Vietnam, Steve Englehart wrote the Secret Empire storyline, a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of the American government. It broke Steve so completely that he abandoned the Captain America identity entirely and became nomad, a man without a country, a man who chose his values over his identity. And this is the through line that connects every era of Steve Rogers in the comics. The political landscape changes, the villains change, the writers change, but Steve doesn't. Not really. When he seems to shift, it's always framed as a deeper understanding of what he already believed. His steadfastness isn't stubbornness, it's the whole point. He was created to be the best of a specific moment in history, and no amount of ice or time or a changing world was ever going to touch that, which is exactly what makes his MCU story so fascinating. Because Marvel Studios took that foundation, a man built for one world, dropped into another, and asked a question the comics rarely had to answer directly. What does it actually cost him?
Doesn't matter what the press says. Doesn't matter what the politicians or the mobs say. Doesn't matter if the whole country decides that something wrong is something right. This nation was founded on one principle above all else: the requirement that we stand up for what we believe, no matter the odds or the consequences. When the mob and the press and the whole world tell you to move, your job is to plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and tell the whole world, no, you move.
The movie opens with a man who has already made his choice. Before the serum, before the uniform, before anyone is watching, Steve Rogers is trying to enlist for the 5th time. Not because he thinks he'll succeed, because it's the right thing to do.
There are men laying down their lives. I got no right to do any less than them. That's what you don't understand.
That's the whole argument right there. The First Avenger isn't a story about a man who becomes a hero. It's a story about a man who already is one, finally being given the body to match. When Dr. Erskine asks why he wants to fight, Steve doesn't say glory. He doesn't say duty in the abstract. He says he doesn't like bullies. He doesn't care where they're from. Small answer. Enormous principle. Then comes
War, guts.
no hesitation, no calculation. He doesn't know it's fake. He just decides in half a second that his life matters less than everyone else's. Colonel Phillips watches, unconvinced. But Erskine already knew. That moment isn't bravery in the dramatic sense. It's just Steve being Steve, a person who has already decided what they're willing to give up. The super soldier serum, in Erskine's own words,
the serum amplifies everything that is inside, so good becomes great, bad becomes worse.
Steve doesn't change when he gets the serum. The world just stops being able to ignore him. And then the movie immediately tests that. After Erskine dies, Steve is handed a costume and a script. He's made into a symbol, not of the values he actually holds, but of the war effort, of recruitment, of selling bonds. The institution takes the thing he is and turns it into a product. He tours the country in a suit that looks like the flag, punching a fake Hitler 8 times a show. Steve performs, but he doesn't become it. There's a quiet but important distinction between Steve wearing the costume and Steve being Captain America. In the Bond tour, he's wearing the costume. He's going through the motions because no one will give him anything real to do. The army got what they wanted from him, a face, a body, a story, and shelved the rest. The moment he hears Bucky's unit is missing, he doesn't ask permission. He doesn't weigh strategy. One man behind enemy lines for one friend, with no authority and no orders. It's irrational by every military metric, but it's completely consistent with who he is. And the film saves its clearest statement for last. When Schmidt's plane is heading for the eastern seaboard, and there's no way to stop it except to bring it down himself, Steve doesn't hesitate.
Peggy. This is my choice.
He chooses the mission over his life. He chooses strangers over himself. Not because he was ordered to, not because he had no other option, because it's what the man who would risk his life on the first days of training would do. The serum didn't teach him that. The war didn't teach him that either. He already knew. That's the foundation the rest of the MCU is built on, and the thing it will spend years trying to break.
This is why you were chosen. Because a strong man who has known power all his life may lose respect for that power, but a weak man knows the value of strength and knows compassion.
If the First Avenger establishes who Steve is, the Avengers is the first time the world pushes back. He's been out of the ice for what feels like 5 minutes. The world he knew is gone. Everyone he loved is dead or old. And instead of time to grieve, he gets a mission. Assemble a team of people who don't trust each other, stop an alien invasion, report to an organization he has no reason to trust yet. Steve does what Steve does. He looks out for bullies. But something happens early in the Avengers that the film treats as almost a throwaway moment, and it isn't. Steve was first faced with the harsh reality of being lied to by the government that he served. This scene clearly reveals Steve's black and white mentality.
We have orders. We should follow them.
He had orders and he had to follow. He has seen the footage of everyone on the ship and wasn't a fan of the Hulk in particular. He has also seen how reckless Tony can be. That was why he was always strict about Banner. But when he was confronted by that truth, after he went to seek it out himself, this was when he had to accept how much the world had changed. The weapons program. S.H.I.E.L.D. hasn't just been studying the Tesseract. They've been using it to build weapons of mass destruction, justified by the threat of a world that's suddenly bigger and more dangerous than anyone knew. Steve confronts Fury directly, and Fury doesn't deny it. This is the first time Steve looks at the institution he's serving and sees something he doesn't recognize. In World War II, the mission was clear. The enemy had a face, a man with a short mustache and a red freaking skull. The people giving orders were, more or less, pointing in the right direction. But this, a secret organization making secret weapons, justifying it with fear.
Because of him.
Me.
This is exactly the kind of thing Steve went to war to fight against. It sounds so much like what Hydra would do. But he doesn't quit. He doesn't walk off the helicarrier. But something shifts. A small crack in the foundation of his trust, one that the Winter Soldier will blow wide open. Then there's Tony. The argument between Steve and Tony on the helicarrier is one of the most important scenes in the entire MCU. Not because of what they say, but because of what it reveals. Tony thinks Steve is a relic, a man with a shield and a history book, out of his depth in a world of suits and algorithms. The same way the military used him for show, Tony still sees him like that, a product for a show. Steve thinks Tony is brilliant and reckless and accountable to no one, including himself. The same way the military and Obadiah saw him, a reckless playboy in for the money and the praise. They're both wrong. That's what makes it interesting, because they prove themselves wrong by the end. But underneath the personal friction is a philosophical collision. Tony believes the best defense is more power, more weapons, more tech, more control. Steve believes the best defense is the right person making the right call. They're not just disagreeing about tactics. They're disagreeing about what it means to be a hero. That argument doesn't get resolved in the Avengers. It just gets paused, because Loki gives them a common enemy and Coulson gives them a reason to care. And when the battle comes, Steve is the one who holds the team together. He's the one giving orders in the street, assigning positions, keeping eyes on the whole picture while everyone else is focused on their piece of it. The man out of time becomes the one thing this fractured, impossible team actually needs. Someone who knows what it means to fight for something bigger than himself without needing credit for it. The Battle of New York ends. The team goes their separate ways. And Steve is left in a world that is bigger, stranger, and less trustworthy than it was before he walked onto that helicarrier. He keeps moving. That's what Steve Rogers does. This didn't break him in any way, but a crack had formed in his belief in the government. Still, this is the same skinny guy from the beginning. No change at all. This is where the Boy Scout name was born.
Tried to hide Blueberry?
Yet you're confused about why they didn't want you around.
An intelligence organization that fears intelligence, historically not awesome.
I think Loki's trying to wind us up. This is a man who means to start a war, and if we don't stay focused, he'll succeed. We have orders. We should follow them.
This is the one where Steve Rogers finds out he's been working for the enemy. Not metaphorically. Not in a the system is flawed way. Literally, the organization he has given 2 years of his life to, the one he stayed in because it felt like the closest thing to the duty he understood, is Hydra. The thing he fought in 1945 never died. It just put on a different uniform. But before we get to that, we first see Steve make a friend outside his colleagues. An actual friend. It's one thing that builds Sam's character. He's someone who treats you like a human being first, before looking at the baggage you come with. That free nature pulls Steve toward him. The first conversation they have sounds so casual that Steve forgets he's talking to a stranger.
Don't say it! Don't you say it! Left. Come on!
Sam doesn't treat him like a relic or a hero. He speaks to him like a fellow veteran.
It's your bed, right?
What's that?
Your bed is too soft. When I was over there, I sleep on the ground, use rock for pillows like a caveman. Now I'm home, lying in my bed, and it's like...
Lying on a marshmallow. Feel like I'm gonna sink right to the floor.
Then he puts him at ease instead of making him feel out of place.
But he's not that thing, though. Guy's like a Stephen Hawking. He's like a smart person.
Marvin Gaye, 1972 Trouble Man soundtrack. Everything you missed, jammed into one album.
I'll put it on the list.
Sam's habit of seeing the man first is the trait that stands out most. He helps Steve without question, and in later films, proves himself useful every time Steve is in trouble.
You don't have to come with me.
I know. When do we start?
He even accepts Bucky first, because he sees the man Bucky truly is.
Enjoy your ride, Buck.
No, you can't call me that.
Why not? That's what Steve called you.
Steve knew me longer, and Steve had a plan.
The Winter Soldier is the film that pays off everything the Avengers quietly planted. That crack in Steve's trust of S.H.I.E.L.D., this is the moment it becomes a fault line. It starts before he even knows the truth.
Yeah, I'm getting a little tired of being Fury's janitor.
Relax.
Project Insight, 3 helicarriers designed to eliminate threats before they happen, makes Steve uncomfortable the moment Fury describes it. Not because the technology is wrong, because the principle is punishment before the crime, fear dressed up as protection. Steve has heard that argument before. He knows where it leads, but he doesn't quit.
That's just some nasty stuff.
Yeah. We compromised, sometimes in ways that made us not sleep so well. But we did it so that people could be free. This isn't freedom. This is fear.
He's still trying to work within the system. Then the system tries to kill him. What the Winter Soldier understands about Steve, what makes it the best Captain America film, is that it doesn't just test his courage. It tests his judgment. Anyone can be brave when the enemy is obvious. But what do you do when the enemy is the institution you serve? When your commanding officer is compromised? When the files, the buildings, the badges, all of it, turns out to be a lie? This is when he starts pushing back, when he goes searching for what he truly wants. He goes to the museum looking for answers, because the world isn't so black and white anymore. He goes to Peggy, the main reason he stayed at S.H.I.E.L.D. And lastly, he goes to see Sam. When Sam tells him about losing his wingman and points out how free he is now that no one is giving him orders, something clicks. All these visits tell him one thing, and it's the same thing Dr. Erskine told him before he died. He has to start over, not with orders or chain of command. His own moral compass, the same one that sent him behind enemy lines for Bucky, the same one that made him uncomfortable in that briefing room. He doesn't need S.H.I.E.L.D. to tell him what's right. He never did. Fury's death is now the final straw. So when he stands face to face with Alexander Pierce, who's giving him an order, he doesn't take it. He trusts his gut. Because
you don't win wars with niceness, Doctor. You win wars
guts.
And then there's Bucky. If the Hydra revelation is the political betrayal, Bucky is the personal one. The one person Steve carried from the past, the one piece of the life he lost that still existed in the present, and he's the Winter Soldier, pointed directly at Steve by the same machine Steve has been dismantling. The most important moment in the film isn't the action. It's when Steve drops his shield. Barnes is beating him, the fight is over, and Steve stops fighting back. Not because he's given up, because he refuses to treat Bucky as the enemy.
Because I'm with you to the end of the line.
The same words Bucky said to him decades ago, before everything. Steve is choosing the person over the mission, the same way he always has. That's the whole character in one moment. A man so philosophically consistent that even when the past has been turned into a weapon against him, even when the ground has completely collapsed beneath his feet, he doesn't change. He just holds on to what he knows is true and refuses to let go. The Winter Soldier doesn't shake Steve Rogers' values. It proves them, because the man out of time turns out to be the only person in the room who was never confused about what was right.
I know I'm asking a lot. But the price of freedom is high. It always has been. And it's a price I'm willing to pay. And if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet I'm not.
Here's the thing about Age of Ultron. It was judged harshly when it came out, and not entirely unfairly. But it has aged into something quieter and more interesting than people give it credit for. Especially for understanding Steve Rogers. And honestly, especially for understanding the collision course between Steve and Tony that Civil War will eventually make catastrophic. I made an entire video glazing this film, so do check it out after this one. Because underneath the overcrowded plot and the rushed pacing, this film is doing something genuinely subtle with both of them. The dialogue handles their individual trauma with a kind of restraint that doesn't announce itself. The humor never gets heavy-handed enough to smother the important parts. It just sits there, underneath the surface, waiting for you to notice. And what it's telling you about Steve Rogers is this. He is homesick. Not for the 1940s exactly. Not for the war. For the life the war interrupted. The dance he never got to have. The friends who are now history. The version of himself that existed before the ice, young and hopeful and still belonging somewhere. At the party, in the brief conversation with Sam, it surfaces quietly. Steve doesn't fit here. Not really. He's present, he's functional, he's Captain America, but he hasn't found home in the modern world, and he isn't sure he's going to. Wanda's vision makes the it visible. His friends, Peggy, music, a dance that never happened, a memory of something he never even got to have. His lost home isn't a place. It's a moment in time that the ice stole from him before he even knew it was gone. Even at Clint's home, he feels that loneliness because of how much he wanted something like that for himself. His pain was made visible.
We can go home.
And then Ultron, of all characters, says the quiet part out loud.
Captain America, God's righteous man, pretending you could live without a war.
It's meant as an insult, but it's actually the most precise thing anyone says about Steve in the entire film, because Ultron is right. The fight has been the thing keeping Steve from sitting still, long enough to feel what he's lost. As long as there's a mission, there's a reason not to grieve. As long as there's an enemy, the anger has somewhere to go. Even in the previous film, Steve said it himself.
You thinking about getting out?
No. To be honest, I don't know what I would do with myself if I did.
Which is exactly why the farmhouse scene hits the way it does. Tony says the reason they fight is so they can go home.
The team. Isn't that the mission? Isn't that the why we fight? So we can end the fight, so we get to go home?
Simple enough, meant as motivation. But watch what happens to Steve in that moment. That line doesn't land as comfort, it lands as a provocation. Because Tony has a home to go back to. Pepper, a future he's building. Something waiting for him on the other side of the fight. Steve has none of that. And the rage that's been sitting quietly underneath all that composure, the anger about losing his home, comes bursting out through his hands as he splits the wood barehanded. It's one of the most revealing moments in Steve's entire arc, and the film barely draws attention to it. Then they rehatch their initial belief system again through this dialogue. Tony's fear of something bigger, the endgame, the need of a bigger armor. And Steve's ties to duty, the safest hands isn't some machine, but theirs. It's two men with completely different philosophies and relationships to the word home, slowly realizing they are not fighting for the same thing. At the end of the film, Steve tries to convince Tony, and maybe himself, that he doesn't need any of it, that the new team is enough.
I don't know. Family, stability. Guy who wanted all that went in the ice 75 years ago. I think someone else came out.
It isn't, and somewhere underneath all that composure, he knows it. Steve always wanted to go home, but it was impossible. Age of Ultron doesn't break Steve Rogers. It just shows you the wound. Civil War is what happens when someone presses on it.
You find a place in Brooklyn yet?
I don't think I can afford a place in Brooklyn.
Well, home is home, you know?
This is the film with the most argument. Tony versus Steve. Here's something people get wrong about Civil War. They say Steve Rogers changed. That the man who punched Hitler and trusted the system became someone stubborn and reckless and impossible to reason with. That he broke the Avengers because he couldn't let go of his past. But that's not what happened. Steve didn't change. The ground beneath him did. And there's a difference. The man who came out of the ice in 2012, the one who walked onto the helicarrier and got to work, that man would probably have signed the Sokovia Accords. Not happily, but he understood duty. He understood chain of command. He believed, in that version of himself, that institutions could be trusted to point in the right direction even when they were imperfect. But the Winter Soldier ended that. When the institution you serve turns out to be the enemy, when the files and the badges and the chain of command are all compromised, you stop outsourcing your conscience. You bring it back inside. You decide that the only thing you can actually trust is your own judgment, because you've seen what happens when you hand that judgment to someone else. So when Thaddeus Ross puts the Sokovia Accords on the table, Steve doesn't see oversight. He sees Project Insight with a different name. A panel of politicians deciding who the threats are, where the Avengers are allowed to go, what they're allowed to do. He's watched that movie before. He knows how it ends. That's not stubbornness. That's experience. While Tony is blinded by the guilt and fear of his own experience, of what happens when his weapons, made for institutions, fall into the hands of individuals. Obadiah Stane, Ivan Vanko, Justin Hammer, Aldrich Killian. These men aren't institutions. They're unhinged individuals who got a taste of power. And that's exactly why Tony genuinely sees the need for the Accords. And then there's Bucky. The Accords are the ideological argument. Bucky is the personal one. And Civil War is smart enough to know that you can't separate them, because Bucky is the living proof of Steve's entire position. Here is a man who was taken, made into an instrument of other people's agendas, and blamed for what he did under their control. Steve looked at that and saw the truth immediately. He had no agency, so he was a victim. The Winter Soldier was what happened when you gave an institution total control over a person. Signing the Accords would mean handing that same control to another institution. Steve can't do it. Not after Bucky. Not after S.H.I.E.L.D. Not after everything. Tony is on the opposite end of this. And this is where the fracture that's been building since the helicarrier finally becomes irreparable. Tony's position, the guilt, the fear, the desperate need for external accountability, is something Steve genuinely understands. But it's also, to Steve, the wrong answer to the right question. Tony blames himself for the weapons Stark Industries built, for the damage those weapons caused in the hands of people he couldn't control. That guilt is real and it's earned. But Steve watching that guilt drive Tony toward surrendering Avengers' autonomy to a UN panel. That's exactly what Steve has spent 3 films learning not to do. For a full breakdown of what drives Tony to that position, I've linked my Tony Stark video in the description, because that argument deserves its own space. To put it plainly, Steve stands where Tony was at in the beginning of his hero's journey.
It's working. We're safe. America is secure. You want my property? You can't have it. But I did you a big favor. When I realized what my weapons were capable of in the wrong hands, I shut it down, stopped manufacturing.
Tony, you chose to do that. If we sign this, we surrender our right to choose.
While Tony stands where Steve was at in the beginning of his own.
We have orders. We should follow them.
Following's not really my style.
But it's run by people with agendas, and agendas change.
That's good. That's why I'm here. When I realized what my weapons were capable of in the wrong hands, I shut it down, stopped.
Because Tony has seen what happens when power has no good oversight, while Steve has seen what happens when that oversight falls into the wrong hands. What matters here is that when they finally break, in that Siberian bunker, with the footage of Howard and Maria Stark playing, It isn't really about Bucky anymore. It's about the fact that Steve knew. He knew what Bucky had done, and he made a choice not to tell Tony. Not out of malice, out of the same instinct that has defined him since 1942, protect the person in front of you. He looked at Tony and made a judgment call that the information would destroy him. And he was right, and it destroyed them anyway. But that doesn't make it the right choice.
I just did you know. Yes.
Steve walks out of that bunker without his shield. He leaves it behind, not because Tony demands it, but because he knows he's operating outside everything the shield is supposed to represent. The institutions, the oversight, the authority. Just the man, just the values. Just the same moral compass he's carried since before anyone gave him a uniform. That's what Civil War is really about. It's about what it costs to be philosophically consistent in a world that keeps asking you to compromise. And Steve Rogers pays every cent.
I know I hurt you, Tony. I guess I thought by not telling you about your parents, I was sparing you, but I can see now that I was really sparing myself. And I'm sorry.
Infinity War doesn't have much to say about Steve Rogers that the previous films haven't already said. He's on the run. He shows up when it matters. He punches things that need punching. The man is consistent. We've established that.
You think all's forgiven?
I'm not looking for forgiveness, and I'm way past asking permission.
Endgame is where the story ends, and it ends in a way that reframes everything. But first, the reunion with Tony. After 3 films of building fracture, after everything, Steve and Tony see each other again for the first time, and the scene is tense, uncomfortable, and then it moves on. For a crack that took 3 movies to create, the reconciliation gets very little space to breathe. It doesn't fully land, and that's worth acknowledging because it's a genuine gap in the storytelling. 2 men who broke that badly deserved more than a Tony joke and a handshake.
Turns out resentment is corrosive, and I hate it.
Me too.
What Endgame does instead is skip to the work, the mission, the time heist. And in doing that, it leans on something that has always been true about Steve. He doesn't need resolution to show up. He doesn't need the emotional loose ends tied before he does what needs to be done. He just does it, which is its own kind of character statement. Even here, even after everything, Steve Rogers is the guy who shows up.
The world is in our hands. It's left to us, guys. And we gotta do something with it. Otherwise, Thanos should have killed all of us.
And then there's the moment. Thanos has destroyed the compound. The gauntlet is gone, and Steve Rogers stands up alone, broken shield strapped to his arm, facing an entire alien army by himself, with no possibility of winning. Just a man who has decided that someone has to stand here, and it's going to be him. That scene from 1942, scaled to the size of a universe. The same instinct, the same choice, the same person. Even before the portals open, that is why he was always worthy of Mjolnir. Not because he's powerful, not because he's pure in some abstract sense, because he is someone who has never once needed a guarantee before doing the right thing. When the battle ends and Tony makes the sacrifice, Steve is left standing in a world that is saved and emptied at the same time. And here is where something shifts. Because for the first time in his entire arc, across every film, every choice, every selfless decision that defined him, Steve Rogers chooses himself. He goes back and gets the dance. You can read that 2 ways. The generous reading is that he earned it. That a man who gave everything, who lost everything, who spent decades frozen and decades fighting, deserves one selfish moment, his home. The harder reading is that it's a retreat. That the man who couldn't let go of his past finally lets the past win. He gets Peggy, but he gets her by leaving. By pretending the future he was part of never happened. The film wants you to feel the first reading, but the second one sits there underneath it. And then there's the shield. Steve doesn't give it to Bucky, the man he crossed every line for. The friend he chose over the Avengers, over Tony, over his own standing. When it's time to pass the legacy forward, he gives it to Sam Wilson, the friend he made when he thought he had nothing left. The present, not the past. Maybe that's the final act of letting go. Maybe Steve Rogers, after everything, finally stops living inside his own history. The man out of time found his time. He just had to go back to get it.
The stone's back, I thought. Maybe I'll try some of that life Tony was telling me to get.
How'd that work out for you?
It was beautiful.
So what does it cost to be Steve Rogers? It costs him his time. The world he was built for dissolved while he was in the ice, and the world that replaced it never quite had a place for him. It costs him his people. The life that the ice interrupted before he even got to live it. It costs him his trust. In institutions, in systems, in the idea that the people in charge are pointing in the right direction. And in Civil War, it costs him the team he spent years building, because he couldn't betray what he knew was right even when everyone he cared about was asking him to. And yet, he never compromised the thing at the center of all of it. That simple, stubborn, deeply unfashionable belief that you do the right thing because it's the right thing. Not because someone's watching. Not because it's safe. Not because it's easy. I think that's why Steve Rogers has stayed with me the way he has. In a franchise full of characters learning to be better, he's the one who just already was. And somehow, that's the saddest thing about him. Because the world never quite deserved him. But he showed up for it anyway.